Good morning, friends. Welcome out here again to my view from the lake. Another beautiful morning. Um, I know most of us have significant dates in our lives that we celebrate birthdays, anniversaries, and then, of course, there's dates of national significance, the 4th of July and 9/11, September 11th. Um, but I want to share with you a date that has personal significance to me, and that's October 20th, 1995. And I want to share you the story about why that's a significant date to me. On that date, October 20th, 1995, I was deployed as a pilot, part of the aviation detachment, aboard a Coast Guard ship. The name of the ship was the Coast Guard cutter Harriet Lane, and we were in the Bering Sea of Alaska. Now, my Coast Guard friends, you may go, wait a minute. The Harriet Lane was a 270-foot cutter, and it was all 270-foot cutters were stationed on the East Coast, not the West Coast, which is true. But in 95, the Harriet Lane was deployed, sent from the East Coast through the Panama Canal over to the Pacific Ocean and up to Alaska because they wanted to do some testing to see if maybe they could reposition some of the 270-foot cutters over to the West Coast and use them for deployments in the Pacific. And I happened to be one of the aviation detachment that was aboard the Harriet Lane as they were doing this testing. Now, another interesting fact is the commanding officer of the Harriet Lane for that deployment was Commander Paul Zukoft, who about 20 years later would become a four-star admiral and become the commandant of the Coast Guard. So just kind of a side note there, but during the deployment, which was pretty rough, they were hoping to find some storms to give the Harriet Lane a good test to see how it would do in bad weather, Alaskan weather, and I was seasick a lot. That's no fun being seasick. Um, but one of the things that I had to help comfort me is I had a little booklet. It was called Our Daily Bread. It was a little devotional booklet, and it had every day of the month. It had a just one page of a scripture reading and a little story about that went along with it, and so I would read that every day, every morning. And on this particular day, October 20th, there was a story about a grandpa who his life was fading, and he'd gathered his family around his bed at the hospital, and his last words with his family were to sing a song, a hymn. It was in the story. It was Grandpa's favorite hymn, and just happens to be one of my favorite hymns. And the hymn was "My Hope," and some of the lyrics from that song are, "My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. When all around my soul gives way, he then is my hope and stay." And then the chorus is, "On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand." And in the story, they sang that song, that hymn with Grandpa, and then Grandpa passed away. That was his last words, Grandpa's last words with that song. Um, Great message in that song that Christ is our solid rock on which we can stand. Well, it just so happens that on that day, October 20th, 1995, later that same day, I received word that was passed down to me on the ship that my grandpa Wayne Guyant, my paternal grandfather, had passed away earlier that day on the same date. And he was the first of my close relatives, my grandparents, and so forth that have passed away. And in the 25 years since, all of my grandparents have passed away, and several uncles, other family members. Um, and because I was deployed in the middle of the Bering Sea, I wasn't able to call grandma or talk to any other family members, and I missed the funeral. And that's part of the sacrifices that people in the military have to make is they miss things like that. Well, as I mentioned, we were in a storm that day, and it was very rough, and I was seasick. Um, but I did find comfort in remembering that even with the passing of my grandfather and feeling sick and being stuck on a ship, that Christ is the solid rock on which I stand, and it brought me comfort, and it always has. Now, then, and as well as now. So I ask you, with everything that's happening in our country and in the world, and maybe even personally with you, how are you? Are you in a storm right now? Do you feel like you're in a storm? Things are out of control, and maybe you're just hanging on, maybe feeling a little fearful and anxious. Well, Jesus is a solid rock. He's never changing. The God of the Bible is immutable. That means he's never changed. He never changes. And Christ is the solid rock on which we can stand. He never changes. He can be an anchor in the storm. So I would encourage you to consider, if you haven't already, what Jesus has done for you and what he can do for you in these times of uncertainty, that Christ is the solid rock on which I stand, and all other ground is sinking sand. Anyway, I hope your family and you are all well and safe and healthy. And that is my view from the lake today. Semper Paratus.